Hi, I'm Dave Webster here at the University of Gloucester with Peter Kernahan from Marley School in Stroud. And we've been talking at some length so far about Buddhism. We've talked about Buddhism in relation to the idea of suffering, the idea of craving. Now, that doesn't sound so cheerful yet. It sounds like we're stuck in a world of misery and endless futile desire. Peter, is there any hope?
Well, in Buddhism, like Kant says, there's a sort of summum bonum. Keown describes linking it to Kant, the summum bonum of nirvana. That's the real hope. And he says there are two kinds of nirvana. There's nirvana in this life. You might have heard of the band, but this is different. Nirvana in this life, which is the moral transformation of an individual. And then there's spiritual nirvana. This is nirvana after death, or pari-nirvana.
Absolutely, and it's an interesting idea that there are two, and sometimes the Buddha seems to say they are exactly the same, but they're experienced very differently. We have to have these two notions of them. There seems to be, within Buddhism, around a lot of discussion about what terms mean and things. There's no more discussion about any other term than there is about nirvana or nibbana, as students might find it written in more Pali texts. So there seems to be an awful lot of issue about what does it mean? What can we say meaningfully about it? How does that kind of come out in the text and the scholars?
Well, one of the scholars, Bhikkhu Bodha, who's key here, controversially says a blissful heavenly rebirth. What do you understand by that? And why might some people be a little bit suspicious about that?
On one hand, you can see why people might go down that route because they want to stress the positive, ultimate goal nature of it. But actually, many Buddhism scholars might be a bit suspicious of the idea of it being just another rebirth. That might imply that getting to nirvana is like climbing a cosmic ladder of good karma. And it's not really about that. It's about the reduction and elimination of karma. And I think a more subtle sense of it, if you look in the second edition of Peter Harvey's Introduction to Buddhism, he talks about nirvana, and he's talking a bit about nirvana during lifestyle. But I was taken by this sentence where he says, to say that nirvana is unconditioned, objectless consciousness indicates something of its nature, but does not penetrate far into its mystery. So that's very kind of this sense of it being unconditioned, which is a core feature of nirvana, objectless consciousness. So while you're still alive and you've achieved a nirvanic state, and you're not in a nirvanic state all the time, even when you're enlightened, it's periodic state. It's consciousness that has no object, has no content, and is unconditioned, is not caused by anything. So this idea that nirvana lies beyond the causal world is hugely transformative. It lies completely beyond, and it's really hard to say anything about it using our language. It seems to take it to a slightly different place to, it's a lovely rebirth. And that gets us, I think, in some different territory.
And I think just before we look at this critically, it's worth thinking about nirvana from a Mahayana perspective. And across Mahayana traditions, there are, within the Tibetan tradition, we have this mirror-like state of consciousness, and across other traditions, we see nirvana as coterminous. To quote Keown again, he sees nirvana as coterminous with samsara. What does that mean in Mahayana traditions?
Yes, it sounds very fancy to say it's coterminous, but if you don't know what it means, it's potentially a problem. To be coterminous means that nirvana isn't something over there or outside of your current reality and you go and get it by this long journey, which is the kind of imagery that you find in Theravada, this long path. Both states are available to us in the here and now. Depending on how we experience the world, we can experience the world as drenched in suffering and misery and pain, all those things we've been talking about, or we can experience the world nirvanically. If we have no grasping and no thirsting, and we are free from that, we're enlightened, we've cut the bonds that tie us to all those kind of miseries, we experience things right now.
And so in Zen tradition, nirvana is awareness of the present moment. You can experience it
absolutely
in the present moment.
That's idea of satori in Zen, of instantaneous awakening.
It'd be really good if we did another video on this, wouldn't it? Yes.
Yeah, it's hard to say, it's even harder to do, but instantaneous awakening, like
just
that.
Like
that. Easy to say, hard to do. But absolutely, nirvana is conceived of so differently that it might bring up in the minds of students, I'm sure it does, some of them, questions about religious language.
Yes.
And what is meant by terms.
Yes. So ineffable, ineffable. Nirvana is beyond knowledge. Now, in terms of religious language, we might talk about this as being non-cognitive or equivocal, a sort of mystical approach. And that has certain echoes, perhaps, with Wittgenstein, language games theory, but there'll be some people who be very critical of that today, would there not?
Absolutely, and you used a couple of words there I think that were kind of interesting. So to call it mystical. Well, and then it's a Wittgensteinian approach to say that which we cannot speak of, we pass over in silence. Yeah. Some might say that, so others would point to the fact that the Buddhist tradition is, to some extent, not hugely mystical in the full Western sense, and would say, well, actually, the problem with talking about nirvana is human language is a system to discuss conditioned phenomena, i.e. stuff in the world, like pens and cups of tea and cake and suffering, things that we have. And nirvana is it is unconditioned. It is beyond that. So the tools we have to talk about these things don't work. Language falters in the face of it.
I want to sustain this because it's such an interesting topic. It occurs to me the ontological argument within Christianity has some interesting parallels here. And we find it coming up again in Aquinas' third cosmological argument. This idea of not the contingent, but the necessary, and in Buddhism we have the unconditioned. Nirvana is the unconditioned, as I think Bodhi says, supramundane state. Philosophically, there are some problems, certainly from an atheist perspective, in this unconditioned state that's parallel or perhaps co-equal with this world. What do you see as some of the debates that could be had, maybe in a three-way debate there between sort of Christian arguments, atheist, Buddhist arguments about this ultimate reality?
I mean, I think it's very tempting to draw that initial comparison, because one thing we want to do in the study of religion is make meaningful comparisons. But you might say it's part of the criticism of the 1970s world religions paradigm, in that all religions have a founder, all religions have a diagnosis, all religions have an ultimate truth, and the one in Buddhism just happens to be called nirvana. That, I think, obliterates the distinctiveness of nirvana within Buddhism. And actually, it doesn't, to use a kind of more philosophical term, it doesn't seem to have the metaphysical status of a god. It's not responsible for creation. It doesn't underlie reality. It doesn't, in the Hindu sense, underlie everything that exists in the sense of Brahman doing that role for Hinduism. So it seems that it's not quite the same, and yet it's probably one of the reasons that it's not accurate to describe Buddhists as being strict atheists. Yeah. They might be non-theists. They're not really interested.
What would let me push you on this? What would so an atheist conversing with a Buddhist might say, well, if this unconditioned, supramundane, entirely simple state, and this seems to echo debates about divine simplicity and such, if that's the case, why does anything at all exist?
An interesting question from a Buddhist perspective in response to that is that it's like the Buddhist parable of a man who's shot in the eye with an arrow. So he's pottering about doing what he wants, doing his garden or whatever people do. Somebody shoots him in the eye with an arrow, and rather than saying, this is quite painful, I would quite appreciate some assistance removing it, instead demands to know, before he's given the instructions to remove it, demands to know what wood it's made out of. Yes. Was it fired from the west? What army fired it? What kind of feathers are those? And the Buddhist response is to say, ouch, life hurts, it's really tough being alive, it's brutal. And here's the answer, we can do something about it. How the world came to be this way is not the Buddha's responsibility. It is if you're using European philosophy, you call it facticity. It's just the way stuff is. Okay. And the responsibility of Buddhism is not to explain creation, but to deal with the unpleasant consequences of it.
Fantastic, what a great debate. Thank you very much.
Thank you.